This is armored train number 12 in the city of Petrograd in 1917. As you can see, a lot of people are standing on the train. The second picture is an armored train which is handed over to its crew in 1942, equipped with a platform for an air observer, armed with an anti-aircraft machine gun. The locomotive is positioned in the center of the train, and on the right side you can see there is a standard T-76 or T-34 tank turret. This episode is particularly based on the armored trains of the Soviet Union that were used between 1917 to 1945. So, publications concerning armored trains are usually very rare to find. Official sources are as good as non-existent or inaccessible for that matter. When material concerning armored trains, a class of weapons not unjustly looked upon as dinosaurs in the field of military arms development, does appear, whether in the form of articles or larger features, there is generally a not inconsiderable response from the interested readers. Many former members of the Special Arms surfaced following the appearance of German armored train in World War II. And primarily, this episode covers the railway guns which were employed by the Soviet Union and their missions and the area of operations. The amount of material available made it necessary to limit the amount to text and photographs, along with a narration, which I'll be doing. It was therefore very hard to cover all of the designers and the commanders of all the trains that were designed from the beginning to the end. However, an interesting number of details has been covered. The following documentation is based solely on the sources from the USSR, and a major engineer Andrei Beruskinov and his words and photographs has been extremely helpful in creation of this episode. In very much cases, history is downright curious. For example, historian Dmitry Volkoganov related that in 1921 that Joseph Stalin was highly indignant at then chairman of the Revolutionary War Council, Leon Trotsky. During his frequent trips to visit the fighting troops, Trotsky not only surrounded himself with soldiers, but also frequently had two armored trains accompanying him. Stalin, who was in any case envied Trotsky because of his talent as a speaker, his energy, and his popularity, he usually viewed him as a challenge. And at that time, he had no way of knowing that he, who could not stand flying, would make use of 8 armored trains of the NKVD while traveling by rail to the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. So the origins of the armored train lie in the advent of railway troops and the railway net. Railway troops appeared in most European nations almost simultaneously with the construction of railroads, although the designs, organization, strength, and equipment varied from nation to nation. The missions of the railway troops were largely similar. In peacetime, they had to build strategically important sections of the track, improve their training methods in the process, eventually test new equipment for the railway industry, and erect artificial structures, including complicated bridges, more cheaply than civilian forces. There follows a description of the railway net that existed at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1900, 14 European nations had railway troops. Smaller ones like Belgium, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, and Denmark each had a company. Austria, Hungary had 2 battalions. Germany had more than 27 companies, and Russia a total of 35 companies, each with 4 officers and 123 men, increased to I think around 260 men in the event of war. The 7 battalions of the Russian Railway were involved in the Russo-Japanese War, which was happening between 1904 to 1905. They proved their military ability there, even if the Russian Empire lost that military adventure. It is worthy of mention that a Russian armored train had previously operated in the Far East. Along with 200 soldiers, it was a component of the Russian contingent of the International Expeditionary Force of major European powers, which took Peking in August 1900 during the Boxer Rebellion. This was an anti-foreigner uprising in northeast China and also partly against the Qing dynasty, which was ruling China back at that time. This locomotive, as you can see, this was part of armored train number 49, which was converted in 1919. And this armored train number 44, armed with 76.2 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, this was pictured back in March 1919. So armored trains possessed no greater significance in Russian military until the First World War. Although it is true that there were several on hand during the war itself, all the participating states had armored trains. However, on the account of rapid freezing of the front, they scarcely played a role in the West. Armored trains were primarily used to guard the rear, as the personnel and the weapons were needed at the front. The command in Germany and Austria reduced the complement of armored trains to 50%. During the First World War, Russian armored trains belonged to the railway troops and were relatively uniformly equipped. Each of the Russian armored trains had two 76.2mm guns and up to 20 heavy machine guns. Initially, the guns were not capable of all round firing. They were installed on rotating pedestals on covered and armored flat cars and possessed only a limited field of fire to the side. The guns positioned at the front and the end of the train could only fire in the direction of the movement to the front or the rear. This configuration subsequently came to be designated as an armored flat car in the Russian army. It was not until during the war where Russian armored trains fitted to the rotating turrets with cannon for all fire. As the railway lines in the area near the front suffered great devastation in the early phase of war, Russian armored trains saw little action at that time. According to Russian experts, contrary to the experience of the Western Front, it was only when positional warfare came that the armored trains were able to support the ground troops effectively. Using shunting tracks along the front, they reacted quickly to changes in the situation and were able to hurry through threatened sectors of the front. It was not until after the October Revolution of 1917, however, that the armored trains saw really widespread use in Russia. This applied to both the White and Red forces and the intervention armies, and following their uprising, they captured Czech, fought from armored trains. Almost everywhere there were large railroad workshops in Moscow, Petrograd, Kharkov, Lugansk, Bryansk, Sarysino, and Kiev. Workers built mostly for the Red Army. This was the designation for initially makeshift armored trains built there. They consisted of coal lorries with cutouts in the sides for machine guns, as well as simple flat cars on which complete field guns were frequently installed. Railroad ties and sandbags formed the provisional armor. The locomotives were often left unprotected. According to Soviet sources, the first action involving one of their armored trains took place in 20 November 1917, 15 km north of Stanitsa Sholbin. It was there to suppress an uprising by a shock battalion of the White General Tuchonin, who had attempted a mutiny in the high command of the headquarters. The armored train used its guns in support of an infantry regiment and a battalion of sailors. It is not known whether the later classic style of cooperation between the onboard shock troop and the train's own weapons with the infantry or the cavalry deployed there. In any case, this combination, which was to remain standard practice in World War II, and the arrangement of weapons in rotating turrets or side bay windows, gun mounts ordered to achieve the maximum possible field of fire, developed in course of fighting in Russia, as well as the grouping of the cars around the locomotive, which was likely gradually drawn into armoring process, as well as controllers at the front and back of the train, for safety in the event of detonating mines or as a defense against explosive-laden cars, which were standard at that time. In the armored train, the command of the revolutionary units, later designated the Red Army, saw a powerful weapon which it could support its fighting units, which were poorly equipped in comparison to the troops of the interventionist and the White Guards. Moreover, the widespread use of armored trains was encouraged because most of the fighting in the initial period of civil war was waged along the railway lines. There were almost no aircraft, and the nation's road network was poorly developed. The railroad tracks thus provided the sole transportation link in the vast spaces of Russia. One can say without exaggeration that armored trains took part successfully in all the major battles in Russia after the autumn of 1917. Frequently, the workers not only built the armored trains but formed their crews as well. In 1918, the Red Army had 23 armored trains. However, by the end of 1919, this figure had risen to 59, and towards the end of the War of Intervention to 103. Several of these trains were repaired and modernized and saw service at the front in World War II. As a rule, the armored trains explored the situation as a sort of advanced guard, engaged the enemy, covered the deployment of friendly infantry, cavalry into battle order, and supported these during attack and retreat with their fire. Armored trains possessed one major advantage compared to field artillery. They could fire without loss of time and even while in motion, and their fire was easily concentrated. They also carried with them a large supply of ammunition. Moreover, they offered protection to the gun crews and they also transported infantry units. They were thus capable of carrying out independent tactical missions. In several cases, Soviet Russian armored trains even carried with them a tethered balloon which was used to observe and direct fire. As a rule, the locomotive was located in the middle of the armored train. Once the train had taken up position, the commander was connected to all the battle sectors by telephone, enabling friendly cavalry or infantry to be supported effectively from the tracks. Armored trains were first used in large numbers during the fighting for Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad, then Volgograd, in October 1918. With the help of a central fire control, it was possible to skillfully maneuver the 12 armored trains with their 50 guns so as to quickly go to the aid of most threatened sectors. In an effort to improve the design of the armored trains, after mid 1918, they were no longer built at the front but only in the workshops. Sheet steel 6 to 8 mm thick replaced the railroad ties and sandbags. Armoring locomotives was now made universal, and all smaller caliber guns were installed in rotating turrets. Machine guns were placed inside embrasures or in retractable bay window gun mounts so that they could fire along the train. However, several armored trains were equipped with 100 mm and 120 mm naval guns. These armored train batteries later served as independent units of the railway artillery within the framework of the coastal defense. Armored trains were now produced mainly by Pulitov, Ishorsky, Obukovsky works. In order to achieve a standardization of the existing diversity, on 31st January 1918, the Military Commission decreed the armored trains of the first class were to consist of a control car, which also carried tools, replacement parts, and technical equipment at the front and rear, a locomotive in the center, and a gun car, maximum caliber of 75 mm, in the front of and behind of the locomotive. The arrangement of the cars of the armored trains of the second class would be the same, but they were to be armed with weapons in the 100 to 150 mm class. Each armored train was to have a crew of 37 to 172 men, and they were to be armed with 2 and 4 cannons as well, 4 to 16 machine guns. In March 1919, the trains were merely classified as light or heavy, but after 1920, the classification into armored trains type A, B, and W took effect. As World War II began to take shape at the beginning of the war against Nazi Germany's, armored trains were often assigned the role of suicide trains. Frequently, they single-handedly covered the retreat of Soviet units in order to delay the enemy for at least a few hours. Many countries involved in the World War II used armored trains in combat operations, but the USSR was the undisputed leader among them. At the time of the invasion, the Red Army and the NKVD troops, which operated near the state borders and the rear, had almost 60 armored trains which were operating both independently and as collective units of the trains of 2 to each, 2 to 3 trains together. So these trains were basically either moving on an independent basis, that is one train on one track. On other occasions, there would be a collection of trains that would be moving together to fight the enemy. In addition to the armored locomotives, armored trains could include enclosed armored railway tracks, which would carry tank turrets, and enclosed trucks with artillery pieces and machine guns. For example, the Stalinets 28 were the heavy armored trains which defended Leningrad with 100 mm guns, 120 mm mortars, 76 mm anti-aircraft guns, and 24 machine guns. In addition to the trucks carrying weapons, the trains had several carriages housing a command post, depot for ammunition, equipment and supplies, a workshop, a kitchen so that the army can cook and live for a longer time, Before the beginning of the combat operations, these were usually uncoupled and pulled to the nearest stretch of the railway line in the rear. During the war, armored trains were supposed to provide fire support to the troops, escort the most important troops, and defend key railway stations and junctions, as well as combat the enemy assaulting forces. Notwithstanding their powerful armaments, these fortresses had relatively weak armor and were highly vulnerable to enemy artillery and armored vehicles in absence of adequate anti-aircraft weapons to aviation for that matter. Because if a plane bomb drops, your train is bound to be doomed because the railway tracks is going to be completely unusable for that period of time until it is repaired. The outbreak of the war came as a real nightmare for Soviet armored trains, which frequently had to cover the withdrawal of Red Army units single handedly. If the enemy managed to sever the railway line, the armored train either had to be blown up or it had to be taken back by its own crew so that it does not fall in the enemy hands. The Nazis commonly used to seize these armored trains and use these things in their anti partisan drives. In the years 1941 to 1942, the USSR lost around 63 armored trains, but the construction of these new trains had been on a full-fledged manner since the beginning of the war. So even though these were like getting destroyed, there was a constant amount of trains being manufactured every year, which was replacing the destroyed trains, and the shortage of trains was never a problem for the Soviets because they were using whatever they could find for manufacturing these trains, even obsolete weapons from museums. The highly effective use to which armored trains could be put was demonstrated in the defense of the cities Tallinn and Leningrad. Sevastopol was defended for almost 8 months by an armored train, which the Germans dubbed as the Green Ghost. After carrying out rapid sorties, it hid in an underground tunnel impenetrable to bombs and shells. However, on June 26, 1942, the roof of the tunnel failed to withstand an intensive air raid and the train was buried inside along with its crew. The outcomes of the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk marked an important tipping point in the war, and the Red Army swept westwards. The situation with armored trains also changed. From desperate suicide trains, they were transformed into a solid backup for advancing troops. During 1943, just 2 trains were lost, and in 1944 and 45, there were no losses at all. Following the liberation of Soviet territory, the armored trains also took part battle in Europe, easily switching to the local rail gauge. Specialized armored trains were fitted with air defense and were able to fire 25 to 37 anti-aircraft cannon, as well as the 12.7 anti-aircraft machine guns, which gives an excellent defense for these trains from the fighter planes. Swiftly traveling great distances, they provided great cover for the advancing troops against threats from the sky, while the anti-aircraft military regiments were still on their way. Two of the mightiest Soviet armored trains, the Kozma-Minin and the Ilya Muromets, which were having up to 45 of armor, even managed to reach the outskirts of Berlin. Even before that, however, the Ilya Muromets took part in a unique armored train duel. On June 4, 1944, near the town of Kovel, it destroyed its German opposite number, which in the Soviet Union was erroneously named the Adolf Hitler. In actual fact, the Third Reich's Panzerjus did not have any names. Throughout the period of the war, Soviet armored trains managed to destroy 370 enemy tanks, 712 vehicles, 344 artillery pieces and mortars, as well as shooting down the 115 German aircraft. 2 Red Army armored trains and 3 belonging to the NKVD troops were awarded the Order of the Red Banner, while 10 separate armored trains were given honorific names. Government awards were conferred on 1 in 4 crew members of the Fortress on Wheels. And this is why the armored train legacy is quite strong among Soviets and in Europe. It is usually loved by most people, although a lot of people find the drawbacks, which are obviously valid in that sense, because running an armored train is technically way harder than going on a road, because you need to lay the infrastructure, You would be requiring a heavy amount of maintenance, replacement of fuel, crew, which is often a great challenge, especially if you have a weather problem or a war-like situation. That's why even though these trains have had a solid record of destroying the enemies, it often came with costly maintenance and infrastructure requirements.